One strand of Charles Namm's career stands out among the earliest research topics he tackled. He returned again and again to this subject consistently for more than half a century, the one subject for which he is probably most widely known and recognized not only by demographers but by the wider community of researchers who have contact with population data. Over these decades, he developed an index of socioeconomic status that bears his name, currently the Namm-Powers-Boyd, or NPB index.
Well, when I first proposed the SES index, some of my seniors at the Census Bureau were skeptical of it. I built a case for it by showing it was a logical follow-up to what Hunt and Edwards had done at the Census Bureau, and I used superior statistical methods.
Himself the successful son of immigrants to the United States who aimed to reinvent themselves in a new land, leaving behind the cultural hierarchies of an old world, Namm's early work at the Census Bureau illustrates a quintessentially American perspective for thinking about the sorting of people into hierarchies of status and life chances. Namm's perspective concentrates on achieved rather than ascribed status, taking for granted that the talents and efforts of each individual play a more important part in this sorting out process than do inherited advantages such as family names, hereditary titles, or accumulated wealth. A common extension of this particularly American mythos about life chances suggests that you are what you do. To do nothing is to be nothing. To do little is to be little. And further, that what you do comes down in the end to how much money you make, your income. But the Namm-Powers-Boyd index goes beyond just measuring your income. It is an index combining several measures of achievements in life. 20 years after the first census working paper, Namm and Mary Powers explained, if education is an indicator of the prerequisite required for an occupation, and income is a measure of the reward that society will bestow on an occupation, then occupation may be viewed as an intervening activity between these two variables and hence a good single indicator of status.
Well, as you know, I was employed by the Census Bureau at two different times. The first time was just after I finished my bachelor's degree at New York University, and the Census Bureau hired me as a junior professional to work on the 1950 census. The second time was after my graduate studies at the University of North Carolina, and I was hired again by the Census Bureau to become chief of the Education and Social Stratification branch, which had been actually set up for me. I explored developing various indicators of social stratification. One of those indicators I explored had to do with an individual's occupation.
Two of the components of the NPB index, education and income, lend themselves to relatively simple measurement, years of formal schooling and dollars of income. The vast diversity of the division of labor in a complex society like the United States, however, poses a great challenge to any attempt to compare different occupations and rank them in some status hierarchy. Researchers have responded to this challenge in two fundamentally different ways. Namm and his colleagues at the Census Bureau already knew about one such ranking scheme proposed by Otis Dudley Duncan a couple of years earlier, attempting to measure the prestige or reputation that people attach to various kinds of work, without any explicit reference to the other two dimensions, education or income. Although the respondents in a national sample who sorted stacks of cards to rank jobs by their prestige probably had some thoughts about education and income in mind. This subjective reputational or prestige approach had the advantage that it could incorporate many intangible factors, such as how much a job contributed to the public good, the authority that someone had over other workers, or how trustworthy or respectable people with different occupations seemed to be. The disadvantage was that such subjective reputational measures depended on who did the sorting, requiring a representative national sample of responses whenever the scores needed to be updated. In fact, Duncan's original sorted rankings have rarely been repeated over the following three-quarters of a century. Such respondents usually ranked the reputation of their own jobs slightly higher than other people would have done, and usually had clearer ideas about jobs closely related to their own than to unfamiliar occupations in other parts of society. In contrast to the subjective reputational rankings of occupational prestige, Charles Namm pushed for what he called the socioeconomic measurement of occupational status when he talked to his superiors at the Census Bureau, such as Paul Glick.
Well, let me start off with Paul Glick, who was my superior in the population division at the Census Bureau. He and I talked from time to time about how all of the indicators of social stratification are related to each other. But we didn't have any particular plans until I pursued this study. At the time, Ed Stockwell was my assistant at the Bureau. And then later on, there were others who took his place. Well, we determined that combined measures of education and income for each occupation would best indicate the occupation's socioeconomic standing.
This approach had the advantage that it could be based on readily available census measures that were routinely collected at regular intervals for the entire population of the United States. These more objective measures were available for an entire list of occupations reported on census returns.
Well, the occupational detail we used was in fact the Census Bureau's own detailed list of occupations. Some of these occupations on the list are distinguished by industry category, such that one occupation may be found in different industries, and the Census Bureau separated them in creating their detailed list.
Charlie did not invent this approach out of thin air. At the Census Bureau, he became familiar with several earlier efforts by previous census officials.
Well, as far back as 1897, William Hunt of the Census Bureau analyzed 1870, 1880, and 1890 census returns on occupation and grouped them into what he called a social scale of life.
William Hunt was one of the earliest proponents of a basic distinction between jobs relying on physical labor, still today in many countries and in international standards for occupations labeled as blue-collar jobs, and those relying on mental activity, which still fall under the heading of white-collar jobs.
In 1917, Alba Edwards, also of the Census Bureau, extended Hunt's work using 1900 and 1910 data and grouped detailed occupation data into a six-fold grouping based on his judgment of the socioeconomic status of each occupation. He went on to specify some subgroups of the six-fold categories. I decided to update Edwards' work using education and information for each occupation instead of my judgment.
The first component of Namm's measure of a particular occupation's status counts years of formal schooling completed by all chief income earners from the 1960 census who reported having that occupation. While this report considered 464 different occupations, a few major occupational headings are illustrated here to show such results. Note that in 1960, as in all census counts, we observe a heaping of responses at certain levels of schooling, such as completing 8th grade, completing high school, or graduating from college, not a smooth distribution like a normal curve.
Well, the measure of education were determined for the chief income recipient and assigned to other family members.
Starting from the lowest reported education for people in a particular occupational group, we can cumulate the share of people having each additional year of schooling or less, yielding the cumulative distribution shown here. Where each cumulative distribution crosses the 50th percentile, representing half of all persons in that occupational group, we can record that median educational level as a summary measure for the group as a whole. This gives the first part of that occupation's socioeconomic score. The higher the score, the longer people with that occupation had to go to school in order to reach that median level of education. When he turned to the other half of his socioeconomic ranking for an occupational group, Charlie decided to consider not just the personal income of the chief income earner in each family, but the total family income reported for all family members in a household.
Family income refers to the sum of amounts reported separately for wage or salary income, for self-employment income, and for other income for all family members. Some families would have multiple earners, which would determine their family's location in the stratification system.
Of course, not everyone appears in census results as a member of a family.
Well, the persons who are not in a family, their own education and income were identified.
Family income also departs from a nice normal distribution, skewing to the right with the highest incomes scattered over an extended range. In the same way that education can be cumulated from the lowest to the highest level, family incomes can be cumulated to find the median family income for all chief income earners who reported a particular occupation. As expected, laborers had the lowest median family income, and professional and technical workers had the highest. This is the other half of the socioeconomic ranking for that occupational group. To get the final ranking for each of the considered occupations, Nam and his colleagues just took the average of the median educational score and the median family income score. Then all the chief income earners in each occupation were counted on a cumulative scale, starting with the occupational group having the lowest median scores.
Using the number of workers in each occupation, the scores for education were ranked from high to low, and a cumulative percentage distribution was created. For example, persons who completed 5 or more years of college, the highest education level, were distributed between the 96th and 100th percentile of the distribution of people.
Each occupation, ranked in order of its median average education and family income, added different numbers of earners to the cumulative total, as can be seen in this illustration. The position of each occupational group along the horizontal axis reflects not only the number of people reporting these occupations, but also the number of people in all other occupations with lower combined median scores. The result has a simple and useful interpretation. It tells us what share of the entire labor force had lower scores than the average worker in that particular occupational group. Because this score is an average for the occupation, Nam and his colleagues knew that the score did not actually apply to the particular person to whom the score was assigned, but rather to the average person in that occupation. Recognizing that a lot of variability of both educational background and resulting income appears dispersed around the median within each occupational category, the final socioeconomic index value for each individual household adds individual level information about the educational attainment of each individual chief income earner.
The chief income earner in a family was judged to be the best indicator of the family's place in the marketplace.
So it was that person's education.
Yes.
This means that a person with more education than someone else in the same occupation will get a higher NPB score. In the same way, the final socioeconomic index value for each individual household also adds individual information about the total family income of people in the household This means that if two families have a chief income earner in the same occupation, the family with higher total family income will have a higher NPB score. The NPB index averages together the group score for the occupation as a whole and separate calculations of each chief income earner's ranking on the scales of years of schooling and family income. There is more to socioeconomic status, as reflected in the NPB index scores, than just rankings of occupations as broad social categories. While these scores do reflect such broad social facts about American life, they also capture individual variability in both educational background and resulting income to give each household a nuanced place in the status hierarchy of society. Today, the NPB Index of Socioeconomic Status is routinely calculated and included in such foundational data products as the Public Use Microdata Samples, or PUMS, released by the University of Minnesota for census products, including historical decennial censuses, the American Community Surveys, and the current population surveys.
The index has received wide approval. Numerous researchers have used it, and it is included in integrated public use microdata series published by the University of Minnesota in PUMS.
The NPB index is among the most widely used summary measures of a person's position in the status hierarchy of society and is available today for population data from Canada as well as from the United States.
Well, the scores actually were first calculated using the 1950 census and have been replicated since approximately every 10 years by Monica Boyd and myself. Monica being a former colleague of mine now at the University of Toronto, who showed a definite interest in it and devised the same calculation for Canada. References to these data, incidentally, can be found in a website which we set up for this purpose, www.npb-ses.info.